rain drummed against the windshield of my old Ford, creating a hypnotic rhythm that made my eyelids grow heavier. I was driving home from a business trip that had stretched on for 3 whole weeks. My job at the insurance company required constant travel, and I was already used to these endless roads, drab motels, and identical roadside diners. But today, something felt off. Exhaustion came in waves, and the road seemed endless. I turned on the radio, hoping the music would help me concentrate. But instead of familiar tunes, I only heard static and strange hissing sounds as if someone was trying to speak from a parallel world. My life lately felt like a broken record. Every day was the same. Waking up at 7, a quick breakfast of instant coffee and a cheese sandwich, battling traffic to work, 8 hours in a stuffy office, sifting through insurance claims and dealing with disgruntled clients. Evenings meant the drive home, dinner in front of the TV, and sleep. Weekends were spent alone, reading detective novels or aimlessly wandering through shopping malls. I had virtually no friends. Work left no time for a personal life, and my social skills had atrophied from constant interaction only with colleagues and clients. The loneliness hit me especially hard. After my divorce from Anna 3 years ago, I hadn't been able to start any new relationships. She left, saying I'd turned into a robot, that I lived only for work and had forgotten how to enjoy life. Perhaps she was right. I really had become a different person after losing my job at a major IT company and being forced to take a position in insurance. Dreams of starting my own business had shattered against the harsh reality of loans and the need to survive. Now I was 35 and I felt like an old man who would never achieve his ambitions. The road became increasingly winding and I realized I seemed to have taken a wrong turn. The GPS showed strange symbols instead of familiar street names, and my cell phone signal had completely vanished. I pulled over to the side of the road and tried to orient myself using the maps on my phone, but the screen flickered, displaying only white noise. Around me was impenetrable darkness, broken only by the faint glow of my headlights. Trees on both sides of the road stood motionless, as if frozen in anticipation of something terrible. The air was unusually quiet. Even the usual night sounds of nature were absent. I decided to keep driving, hoping to find some settlement or at least a road sign. Time passed, but the landscape remained unchanged. The same dark trees, the same deserted road. I was running out of gas and I started to genuinely worry. Suddenly, city lights appeared ahead. I breathed a sigh of relief and pressed the accelerator, but the closer I got, the stranger the city seemed. The buildings looked familiar, yet something was off about them. The architecture was similar to my hometown, but everything felt inverted, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. Upon entering the city, I immediately felt like I had stumbled into some unreal place. The streets were deserted, even though the clock showed only 9 in the evening. Not a single person. Not a single car. Only rare streetlights cast a yellowish glow on the wet asphalt. I drove slowly down the main street, trying to figure out where I was. The shops were closed, but their signs glowed with a strange, almost dead light. I noticed a cafe called Cozy Corner, exactly like the one in my hometown, but here it was on the other side of the street. Stopping at a traffic light, I looked around carefully. The house to my right was an exact replica of my childhood home, where I had lived with my parents until their deaths in a car accident 10 years ago. But the windows were dark and the garden looked neglected. A strange feeling of déjà vu mixed with anxiety overwhelmed me. I knew every turn of these streets, every building, but everything was out of place, as if someone had put together a puzzle incorrectly. After driving a few more blocks, I saw my old school. It stood exactly where it should have been, but it looked older and gloomier. The paint on the walls was peeling and some windows were boarded up. I stopped and got out of the car to get a better look at the building. The air was unusually cold for a summer night, and it carried a metallic, hospital-like smell. I walked to the main entrance of the school and peered through a window. The hallways were empty, but I could have sworn I saw shadows gliding along the walls. Returning to my car, I noticed it looked different. The paint had dulled, and dents had appeared on the body that weren't there before. I touched the metal. It was cold as ice. Getting back behind the wheel, I tried to start the engine, but it only coughed laboriously and refused to turn over. After several attempts, the engine finally started, but it ran unevenly as if choking. I decided to find a motel or hotel to spend the night and sort things out in the morning. The Quiet Harbor Hotel stood in the same place as it did in my city, but it looked abandoned. The neon sign flickered erratically, some letters not lighting up at all. I parked in front of the entrance and went inside. The lobby was empty, but the reception desk was lit by a dim lamp. An old registration book lay on the counter, its pages yellowed with age. I rang the bell, but no one appeared. After waiting a few minutes, I took the key for room 237 myself, the same room I had stayed in my own city several years ago. Climbing the creaking stairs to the second floor, I found my room. The key turned easily in the lock as if I had been there before. The room was an exact copy of the one I remembered, but all the objects were covered in a thin layer of dust. The bed was made, but the linens looked old and yellowed. I turned on the light, and the overhead lamp crackled, casting uneven shadows on the walls. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I tried to make sense of what was happening. This city was too similar to my hometown to be a coincidence, yet at the same time, it was completely different. I pulled out my phone, but the screen still showed only static. The wall clock ticked loudly and erratically, as if time flowed differently here. I lay on the bed, fully dressed, hoping that everything would become clear in the morning, but sleep wouldn't come. Thoughts of what was happening to me swirled in my head, and the more I thought, the more unreal my situation seemed. Somewhere in the hallway, footsteps sounded. Slow, heavy footsteps that drew closer to my room. I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and I heard someone gently scratching at the wood. My heart pounded wildly, and my breathing became ragged. I went to the door and peered through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps resumed and began to recede, dissolving into the silence of the old building. In the morning, I woke to the strange sensation that someone was watching me. Sunlight filtered into the room through the grimy curtains, but it was unnatural, too pale and cold. I got out of bed and went to the window to look outside. The city appeared even more dismal in the daylight. The buildings seemed old and dilapidated, the paint peeling from their walls, many windows boarded up. But the strangest thing was the streets were still utterly deserted. No people, no cars, not even dogs or cats, just empty sidewalks and a dead silence. I washed my face with cold water from the bathroom tap, which flowed in a rusty trickle and had a metallic taste. The mirror above the sink was covered in cracks, and my reflection looked distorted, as if I were looking at myself from another dimension. My eyes seemed deeper than usual, and my skin had an unhealthy gray tint. I touched my face, assuring myself it was indeed me, but the sense of unreality wouldn't leave me. Even my own body felt alien, as if I was trapped in another's shell. Descending to the hotel lobby, I found the reception desk still empty. The registration book was open to the same page as yesterday, but now I noticed it contained the names of people I knew. My next-door neighbor, Mikhail Petrovich, who had died of a heart attack 2 years ago. My former colleague, Svetlana, who had perished in a car accident last winter. My high school math teacher, who had passed away from cancer 5 years ago. All these people were dead, yet their names were in the register and their check-in dates were recent. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, finding more and more familiar names of people who were no longer alive. I rushed out of the hotel and got into the car, which started on the first try, but the engine ran strangely quietly, as if its sound was absorbed by the surrounding space. I decided to explore the city more thoroughly, hoping to find some explanation for what was happening. First, I drove to my childhood home, which I had seen last night. The house stood in the same place, but it looked exactly as it had on the day my parents died. The same peeling fence, the same curtains in the windows, the same old mailbox with our family name. I got out of the car and walked to the gate. It opened with a soft creak, and I entered the yard. The garden was exactly as I remembered it. The same apple trees, the same vegetable patches, the same garden paths. But everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if time had stopped here. I walked to the porch and peered into the living room window. It was dark inside, but I could make out the familiar furniture. The same sofa where I did my homework. The same dining table where we had family dinners. Even the same plates Mom had set out before her last trip were on the table. The door was unlocked and I went inside. The air in the house was stale and smelled sweetish and nauseating. I walked into the living room and saw that all the objects were in precisely the same places I remembered them. Family photos on the mantelpiece, old books on the shelf, even Mom's jewelry box on the dresser. But when I tried to pick up one of the photos, it crumbled to dust in my hands. I snatched my hand back in horror and saw that the photo wasn't of my parents and me, but of some unfamiliar people whose faces were blurred and indistinguishable. Going upstairs, I entered my old room. It was exactly as I had left it when I went to university. The same posters on the walls, the same desk, the same bed. But when I opened the closet, I saw not my childhood clothes, but strange, unfamiliar items. Black suits like funeral attire, white shirts with high collars and black ties. The clothes were my size, but looked old-fashioned, as if from another era. I picked up one of the shirts and felt that the fabric was cold and damp, as if it had lain in the ground for many years. I ran out of the house, got in the car, and drove further through the city. I passed by familiar places, but all of them were distorted and wrong. The park where I played as a child was now filled with dead trees, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes. The playground was in the same spot, but the swings swayed on their own, creaking in a wind that wasn't there. The sandbox was filled not with sand, but with some gray dust in which white shards like bones were visible. I stopped at the shop where my first love, Katya, used to work. We dated in high school but broke up when I left for university in another city. She married a local guy and had 2 children. I knew she was still alive and happy, but when I entered the shop, I saw her behind the counter. She looked exactly as she had 20 years ago, young, beautiful, with long blonde hair. But her eyes were empty like glass, and she looked right through me, not recognizing me. I tried to speak to her, but she didn't respond. Her lips moved silently as if she was trying to say something, but there was no sound. I came closer and saw that her skin had a waxy pallor and strange dark spots were visible on her neck. When I reached out to touch her, she suddenly turned her head and looked at me. Her gaze was filled with such sorrow and despair that I involuntarily stepped back. She opened her mouth as if to scream, but instead of a cry, a dark liquid poured from it, dripping down her chin onto her white blouse. I ran out of the shop, and it took me a long time to compose myself. My hands were trembling and my breathing was ragged. I was beginning to understand that this city was not inhabited by living people, but by something else. Shadows, memories, perhaps the ghosts of those I knew. But why was I here? How did I get to this place? And most importantly, how do I get out? I drove to the insurance company building where I had worked for the last 5 years. The building stood in the same place but looked abandoned. The windows were broken and strange plants like ivy but black grew on the walls. I went inside and went up to the 3rd floor where my office was located. The corridors were empty, but the doors to all the offices were open. I looked into my boss's office, Vladimir Semenovich. He was sitting at his desk, hunched over papers. When I entered, he looked up and I saw that his face was half decomposed. One half looked normal, but the other was eaten away by worms and covered in mold. He looked at me and smiled, but the smile was terrible. Half his mouth was normal, while the other half exposed rotting teeth and bleeding gums. He said something, but I couldn't make out the words. The sound was distorted, as if he was speaking from underwater. I noticed that there were insurance files on his desk, and among them was my own file. I grabbed the folder and opened it. Inside was a photograph of a wrecked car, my car, and a traffic accident report. The date on the report was yesterday, the very day I was driving home from my business trip. My heart stopped. I continued reading the report. The driver of a Ford Focus, Alexander Nikolaevich Morozov, 35 years old, died at the scene from injuries sustained. Cause of accident, speeding in adverse weather conditions. Time of death, 23:47. I reread the report several times, disbelieving my eyes. According to the document, I was dead. I had died in a car accident last night driving home from my business trip. But how was that possible? I was alive, standing here, reading this report. I could feel my heart beating, blood flowing through my veins. I couldn't be dead. This was some kind of mistake, a cruel joke. I threw the folder onto the desk and ran out of the office. Vladimir Semenovich watched me go, his terrible smile widening even further. I ran downstairs and out into the street. The sun still shone with that same pale, cold light, and the city looked even more dead. I got into the car and tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't start. I turned the key several times, but the car only coughed laboriously. Finally, the engine started, but it ran very quietly, almost silently. I looked at the dashboard and saw that the speedometer needle showed 0, even though I was clearly moving. I drove to the hospital where my doctor, Dr. Petrov, worked. Perhaps he could explain what was happening to me. The hospital looked exactly like the one in my hometown, but it was empty. The corridors were dark and strange sounds emanated from the wards. Groans, sobs, whispers. I found Dr. Petrov's office and went inside. He was sitting at his desk writing in a medical chart. When I entered, he looked up and saw me. His face was pale, almost transparent, and his eyes were empty like glass spheres. He opened his mouth to say something, but instead of words, a swarm of black flies flew out. They circled around me, buzzing and trying to land on my face. I waved my hands, swatting them away, and ran out of the office. The flies pursued me down the corridor, their buzzing growing louder and more aggressive. Running out of the hospital, I stopped in the parking lot and tried to collect my thoughts. Everything I saw indicated that I was indeed dead. But then where was I? Was this the afterlife? Purgatory? Or some strange form of existence after death? I remembered my grandmother's words, who said that after death the soul remains on earth for a while, not understanding what happened. Perhaps this was the state I was in. I got in the car and drove to the cemetery. If I was truly dead, I had to find my grave there. The cemetery was in the same place as in my hometown, but it looked much larger. Rows of graves stretched to the horizon, and many of them were fresh. I walked along the central aisle, reading the names on the headstones. Many of them were familiar, people I knew who had died in recent years. Finally, I found what I was looking for. A fresh grave with a black marble headstone on which was engraved in gold letters, Alexander Nikolaevich Morozov, 1989-2024, beloved son. Below the inscription was my photograph, the very one I had taken for documents a few years ago. I stood before my own grave, and the reality of what was happening finally hit me. I was dead. I had died in a car accident while driving home from my business trip. The rain, the fatigue, the dark road, all led to the tragedy. But why was I still here? Why hadn't I moved on to the afterlife like everyone else? I knelt before my grave and for the first time in many years wept. Tears streamed down my cheeks, and I realized they were tears not only of grief but also of relief. At last I knew the truth. I don't know how long I spent on my knees before my grave. Time in this place flowed differently, and the sun hung motionless in the sky, as if frozen in one spot. Tears had dried on my cheeks, leaving salty tracks, and I felt a strange emptiness inside. Not a physical emptiness, no, my body still felt real, heavy, painfully familiar. It was an emptiness of the soul, a realization that everything I considered my life had ended the moment my car veered off the road and crashed into a tree. I got up from my knees and looked around. The cemetery stretched in every direction, and I realized it was much larger than it first appeared. Graves extended beyond the horizon, and many of them weren't just familiar names, but people who had played important roles in my life. I saw the grave of my first boss, who had died of cancer 3 years ago. Next to it stood the grave of my school friend Olya, who had taken her own life after a divorce. Further on was the grave of my communal apartment neighbor from my student years. Old Vasily Ivanovich had died in his sleep, and I only learned about it months later. But the most terrifying thing was that among all these graves, I also saw ones that shouldn't exist. The grave of my ex-wife Anna, who, as far as I knew, was alive and well. The grave of my best friend from university, Seryoga, with whom I had lost touch years ago, but who was definitely alive. The grave of my mother with a death date that was 5 years later than her actual date of death. This place was not just a cemetery. It was a repository of all my fears, all the people I loved or was afraid of losing. I walked over to Anna's grave and read the inscription. Anna Sergeyevna Morozova, 1992-2024. Beloved wife. The death date was yesterday's, the same day I died. Below the photo it said, died in a car accident with her husband. My heart skipped a beat. Was she with me in the car? But I didn't remember that. I remembered driving alone, being alone for 3 years since our divorce. Or was this part of my post-mortem nightmare? I tried to recall that evening in more detail. I had finished work in a provincial town where I was investigating several insurance cases. The last one was a car accident involving a young family, husband, wife, and a small child. The family was driving to their dacha when their car veered off the road on a rainy night. Everyone died instantly. I remembered how difficult it was to write the report for that case, how I thought about life ending at any moment, how fragile our existence was. After work, I went into a local bar to have a drink and try to forget what I had seen. There was a woman there who strongly resembled Anna. The same auburn hair, the same green eyes, the same smile. We started talking, and she told me she had also recently divorced, that she felt lonely and lost. We had another drink, and I offered to give her a ride home. She agreed, and we drove off together. The memories became clearer. Yes, she was with me in the car. We were driving and talking about life, about how difficult it was to start over after a divorce. She talked about her plans, about wanting to move to another city and start a new life. I told her about my work, how tired I was of constant travel and grim insurance cases. The rain intensified and visibility worsened. Then I remember a sharp turn, a slippery road, the headlights of an oncoming car. A woman's scream, the sound of breaking glass, metal crushing on impact. Pain, so sharp it took my breath away. Darkness and silence. After that, emptiness, and then I woke up in that hotel in the mirrored city of the dead. So I wasn't alone. That woman died with me, and now we were both in this strange place. But where was she? Why hadn't I seen her? I looked around trying to find her grave, but the cemetery was so vast that the search could take an eternity. I decided to return to the city and try to find her there. The car started without a hitch, and I drove back through the empty streets. The city looked even more dead than it had in the morning. The buildings seemed faded, as if they were slowly being absorbed by a gray emptiness. I stopped at the bar where I had met the woman. It was called The Last Berth and was an exact replica of the establishment where we met. I went inside and saw that the bar was full of people, but they were all motionless, as if frozen in time. Behind the bar stood the bartender I remembered. He was wiping a glass with the same cloth, with the same motion I had seen yesterday. Customers sat at tables, but they didn't move, didn't talk, didn't even breathe. Their eyes were open but empty like glass. I walked over to a table where a middle-aged man was sitting. He held a glass of beer in his hand, but the beer didn't decrease and the foam on it didn't settle. In the corner of the bar, at the same table where we had sat yesterday, I saw her. She sat in the same pose, in the same clothes, with the same smile on her lips. But the smile was frozen, unnatural, and her eyes stared into nothingness. I walked up to her and tried to speak, but she didn't react. I touched her shoulder and she suddenly turned her head. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and there was no life in her eyes. She opened her mouth and a voice poured out. But it wasn't her voice. It was my own voice, speaking the same words I had uttered yesterday. "Would you like a ride? I'm going that way." She nodded and we got up from the table. I realized I was caught in some kind of time loop where the events of that evening repeated again and again. We left the bar and got into the car. She sat in the same spot where she had sat yesterday, and we drove along the same road. The conversation was exactly the same, word for word. She talked about her divorce, I talked about my job. The rain intensified just as it had yesterday. But now I knew what would happen next, and I tried to change the course of events. I tried to turn onto another road, but the steering wheel wouldn't obey me. The car drove along the same route as yesterday, as if controlled by an invisible force. I tried to hit the brakes, but the pedal didn't work. I tried to warn the woman about what was going to happen, but only the same words I had uttered yesterday came out of my mouth. We were approaching the place where the accident occurred. I saw the familiar turn, the slippery road, the headlights of an oncoming car. The woman screamed, and we crashed into the tree. The sound was deafening, the pain unbearable. But this time I didn't lose consciousness. I saw our car turn into a pile of metal, blood dripping down the shattered glass, and the woman next to me stopped breathing. But within seconds we were back in the bar, sitting at the same table, and everything began anew. I understood that this was my hell, the eternal repetition of that last hour of my life, reliving my death and the death of an innocent woman I had dragged down with me over and over again. The loop repeated many more times. I tried to scream, tried to run, tried to change the course of events, but nothing worked. Each time we ended the same way: a car crash, death, a return to the bar. The woman next to me was like a doll, repeating the same movements, uttering the same words. She wasn't aware of what was happening, didn't understand that we were dead. After a dozen repetitions, I noticed that something changed each time. The woman became paler, her voice grew quieter, and her movements became more mechanical. The bar around us also changed. The patrons became more and more blurred, as if they were slowly being erased. Cracks appeared on the walls and the air grew increasingly stale. I realized this place was falling apart. My personal hell wasn't eternal. It was slowly disintegrating, and soon nothing would remain of it. But what would happen to me then? Where would I go when this nightmare ended? I remembered the priest's words at my parents' funeral. Every person receives what they deserve after death. What did I deserve? What had my life been like? I began to remember. My life had been gray, joyless, full of missed opportunities. I never truly loved anyone, not even Anna. I married her not out of love, but because it was expected, because it seemed time to start a family. I wasn't cruel, but I wasn't kind either. I didn't help people, didn't make the world better. I simply existed, performing my duties, getting paid, spending time in front of the TV. Even my work was connected to other people's misfortunes. I investigated insurance cases, assessed damages, calculated the cost of human tragedies. How many times had I denied people payments, citing minor clauses in contracts? How many times had I seen the tears of widows and orphans but remained indifferent? I thought I was just doing my job, but in reality I was part of a system that turned human suffering into numbers in reports, and in the end, I caused the death of an innocent woman. I was drunk when I got behind the wheel. Not heavily, but enough to lose control on a slippery road. I could have called a taxi, could have stayed in a motel for the night, but I didn't. I took a risk. and that risk cost 2 lives. The loop repeated once more, but now I saw something I hadn't noticed before. At the moment of the accident, when our car crashed into the tree, I saw the woman's face. Not the lifeless face she wore in this world of the dead, but her real face, full of horror and despair. She understood she was dying, and in her eyes I saw an accusation. She had trusted me, and I had betrayed that trust, leading to her demise. I realized this wasn't just a time loop. This was my punishment, my way of understanding my guilt. Each repetition forced me to comprehend more deeply what I had done, the price paid for my irresponsibility. The woman next to me was not just a victim. She was a mirror reflecting my guilt. The bar around us continued to disintegrate. The walls were covered in mold. The floor had collapsed in several places, and the ceiling began to crumble. The patrons disappeared one by one as if they had never existed. Only I, the woman, and the bartender remained, who continued to wipe his glass. I got up from the table and walked over to the bartender. He looked up at me, and I saw that it was my own face, but 20 years older. Wrinkles furrowed his skin, his hair was gray, and his eyes were dulled with fatigue. "Do you understand?" he asked in my voice. "Yes," I replied. "Then it's time to go," he said, and pointed to a door at the back of the bar that hadn't been there before. I looked at the woman. She was still sitting at the table, but now she was looking at me. There was no longer accusation in her eyes, only sadness and understanding. "I'm sorry," I said. She nodded and dissolved into the air like everything else in that bar. Only I remained, and the door behind which the unknown awaited me. I stood before the door that had appeared in the depths of the decaying bar. It was made of dark wood covered with strange symbols I couldn't read, but which filled me with an inexplicable dread. The door was ajar, and cold air streamed from the crack, smelling of earth and decay. I knew that beyond this door awaited something final, something that would determine my fate in the afterlife. I turned back to look at the bar one last time, but it was already gone. The walls, floor, and ceiling had vanished. An endless gray void stretched around me, and only the door remained real. I knew I had no choice. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Beyond the door was a long corridor, its walls lined with black stone. Torches in metal holders cast dancing shadows, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. The air was stale and heavy, each breath a struggle. I walked down the corridor, my footsteps echoing against the walls, creating a haunting symphony of solitude. The corridor seemed endless, but gradually I began to notice changes in the walls. Images appeared on them, scenes from my life, carved into the stone with astonishing precision. Here I was as a child, lying to my parents about a broken vase and letting my younger sister be punished for it. Here I was in school, failing to stand up for a classmate being beaten by bullies. Here I was in university, plagiarizing a term paper from a top student and getting a high grade for it. Each scene was a painful reminder of my weaknesses, my cowardice, how I had always chosen the easy path throughout my life. I had never committed serious crimes, never killed anyone, robbed or assaulted. But I hadn't been a good person either. I was a mediocrity who had passed through life, leaving nothing but pain and disappointment in my wake. The corridor led me into a vast hall, its ceiling lost in darkness. In the center of the hall stood a massive stone table, and behind it sat a figure in a black cowl. I couldn't see its face, only a deep shadow beneath the hood. The figure's hands were folded on the table, and I noticed they weren't ordinary hands, but withered, mummified limbs. "Alexander Nikolaevich Morozov," the figure spoke, its voice sounding like the whisper of wind in a desert. 35 years of life. It's time to tally the accounts. I approached the table, and the figure raised its head. There was no face beneath the cowl, only emptiness from which 2 red embers stared at me instead of eyes. "I know who you are," I said. "You're here to judge me." "I do not judge," the figure replied. "I merely execute what you yourself chose through your actions. Every person determines their own fate after death. The figure extended a withered hand, and a book appeared in the air, thick, leather-bound with yellowed pages. It opened on its own, and on the first page I saw my name, written in red ink. "The book of your life," the figure explained. "Every deed, every thought, every decision is recorded here. Do you wish to read?" I nodded, though I knew it would be painful. The pages began to turn on their own, and I saw my life in full detail. Not just actions, but thoughts, emotions, intentions. Everything I had hidden from others, what I had even hidden from myself. I saw myself tormenting a neighbor's cat as a child, simply because I was bored. Stealing money from my mother's purse for cigarettes as a teenager. Abandoning a girl in my youth when I found out she was pregnant, and never caring about the fate of my child. Cheating on my tax returns as an adult. Taking bribes from clients who wanted baseless insurance payouts. "That's not all," the figure said, and the pages continued to turn. Now I saw not my actions, but their consequences. The girl I abandoned never managed to build a personal life and raised her child alone. My son grew up without a father, became a drug addict, and died of an overdose at 20. Clients I denied payments went bankrupt, lost their homes, some committed suicide. "Every one of your actions had consequences," the figure continued. "You thought you lived only for yourself, but your life was connected to the lives of thousands of other people. And most of these connections brought pain and suffering." I couldn't look at the pages of the book anymore. The burden of guilt was unbearable. All my life I had thought I was an ordinary person, no worse than others. But now I saw the truth. I had been a source of pain for many people, and I hadn't even suspected it. "What will happen to me?" I asked. "You chose your own fate," the figure replied. "You lived selfishly, thought only of yourself, caused pain to others. Your punishment will correspond to your actions." The figure rose from the table and approached me. It was much taller than me, and an icy cold emanated from it, penetrating to my bones. "You will be returned to the world of the living," it said. "But not as a human. You will become what you were all your life, a parasite that feeds on others' pain. You will wander the earth, invisible to people, but able to influence their lives. You will whisper evil thoughts to them, push them towards bad deeds, sow discord and hatred." I felt my body begin to change. My skin became gray and rough, my hands turned into clawed paws, and sharp teeth began to grow from my mouth. I tried to scream, but instead of a human voice, a hoarse howl escaped my throat. "This is not the end," the figure continued. "This is only the beginning of your torment. You will remember who you were, you will understand what you are doing, but you will not be able to stop. You will be eternally hungry, but never sated. You will be alone, but never find peace." The transformation was complete. I looked at my hands and saw monstrous claws. I walked over to a mirror that appeared on the wall and saw my reflection. It wasn't me. It was a repulsive creature with red eyes, sharp teeth, and gray skin. But my mind remained human, and I understood the horror of my situation. "Why?" I managed to croak in a distorted voice. "Because you chose this path yourself," the figure replied. "Every time you could have acted kindly, you chose selfishness. Every time you could have helped, you passed by. Every time you could have told the truth, you lied. You created this hell for yourself." The figure raised its hand, and I felt myself being pulled into a vortex of darkness. I flew through space and time and suddenly found myself on a familiar street. It was my hometown street, but now I saw it through different eyes. I saw people's auras, their thoughts, their fears, and I felt an insatiable hunger, a hunger for others' pain. I approached a house where an elderly woman lived. She was lonely. Her children hadn't visited her in a long time. I entered her house, invisible to her, and began to whisper thoughts to her that her children didn't love her, that she was a burden to them. I saw her face contort with pain, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks, and I felt a repulsive pleasure from her suffering. But simultaneously with this pleasure came self-loathing. I understood what I was doing, understood that I was causing pain to an innocent person. but I couldn't stop. The hunger was stronger than my will. I moved to another house where a young family lived. The husband and wife loved each other, but they had minor disagreements like all married couples. I began to amplify these disagreements, whispering suspicions of infidelity to each of them about their partner. I saw their love turn into hatred, their happiness crumble. And again, I felt a repulsive pleasure and at the same time an unbearable pain from the realization of what I was doing. This continued day after day, year after year. I wandered the world, an invisible demon that fed on others' suffering. I destroyed families, pushed people to suicide, sowed wars and conflicts. And with each evil act, I hated myself more and more, but I couldn't stop. I realized this was true hell. Not fire and brimstone, but the awareness of my own vileness with a complete inability to change. I was doomed to eternally commit evil, understanding its nature and hating myself for it. Sometimes I met other beings like me. They were demons who had once been human too, but had chosen the path of evil. We couldn't communicate with each other. Each was trapped in their own hell of loneliness. But I saw in their eyes the same pain, the same despair that tormented me. A long time passed, perhaps decades, perhaps centuries. Time lost its meaning for me. I returned to my hometown, which had changed greatly. New buildings, new people, new technologies. But the essence of human nature remained the same. All the same fears, all the same weaknesses, all the same desire for the easy path. I entered the new office of the insurance company where I had once worked. Now other people worked there, but their work was the same. They evaluated human tragedies in monetary terms. I saw a young employee who reminded me a lot of myself in my youth. He was reviewing a case about a family's death in a car accident and thinking about how to find a reason to deny the payout. I approached him and began to whisper thoughts that this family didn't deserve sympathy, that they were responsible for their own deaths. I saw his face harden, the last glimmer of compassion disappear. He decided to deny the payout, condemning the deceased's relatives to poverty. And at that moment I realized the circle was complete. I had become the reason this person would follow the same path as me. He would live selfishly, cause pain to others, and eventually end up in the same hell I was in. And I would become the cause of a new demon's birth. I understood that evil begets evil, that every evil act creates a chain of new evil acts. I was not just a victim of my own sins, I was their disseminator. I infected this young man with my evil just as I had once been infected myself. But the most terrifying thing was that I couldn't stop. The hunger for others' pain was stronger than any moral considerations. I was doomed to eternally commit evil, creating new demons who would continue to do evil. This wasn't just a chain. It was an exponential progression of evil, and I was one of its sources. I left the office and looked at the city. Now I saw its true nature. Everywhere I looked, I saw invisible demons like me. They whispered evil thoughts to people, pushed them towards bad deeds, fed on their suffering. And every day their numbers grew because every person who chose the path of evil eventually joined their ranks. I understood that the world of the living and the world of the dead were not separated by a clear boundary. They existed in parallel, influencing each other. The living, through their actions, determined their fate after death, and the dead influenced the living, pushing them towards good or evil. I sat on a bench in the park and tried to remember my human life. But the memories were blurred as if covered by a veil. I remembered facts, but not emotions. I remembered having parents, but I didn't remember if I loved them. I remembered being married, but I didn't remember what I felt for my wife. The only thing that remained vivid in my memory was the feeling of guilt. Guilt for what I had done in life. Guilt for what I was doing now. Guilt for what I would do in the future. This guilt was my constant companion, my curse, and my punishment. I thought about the woman who had died with me in the car accident. Where was she now? Had she ended up in the same hell as me? Or had her innocence saved her from such a fate? I wanted to find her, wanted to apologize, but I knew it was impossible. Our paths diverged at the moment of death, and now each of us carried our own burden. The sun was setting behind the horizon, and the city lights came on. People hurried home to their families, to their joys and sorrows. They had no idea that invisible demons swarmed around them, feeding on their emotions. They lived their lives, made their choices, determined their destiny. I got up from the bench and walked on. An eternity awaited me, an endless succession of days filled with evil and suffering. I was doomed to this existence, and there was no way to atone for my sins. I could only continue my path, sowing evil and hating myself for it, but deep down a faint hope flickered. Perhaps someday I would find a way to break this vicious cycle. Perhaps I would be able to renounce evil even if it cost me unbearable torment. Perhaps I would find a path to redemption. For now I walked through the dark streets of the city, an invisible demon among the living, carrying my burden of guilt and despair. My story ended with death, but my torment had only just begun. And I didn't know when or how it would end. Eternity lay ahead, and I was not ready for it.